A quick review of lichen identification characteristics and 8 lichens to know and love. Recall, please, that foliose lichens are stratified. Recall that lichens are fungi. Fungi are filamentous. The upper and lower cortex are where the filaments are packed together and it forms sort of like a skin. And the interior of the lichen is puffy strands that make up the medulla. The algal layer, which usually when it's a layer is algae, although some lichens have blue-green bacteria, which are not algae, but the photobiont, which is usually algae, is in a layer just below the upper cortex. And the lower cortex sometimes has attachment structures, not absorption structures, but attachment structures called rhizines. Lichens reproduce often sexually by the production of ascospores in asci, which are clustered together into structures called ascocarps, of which the most common one is this button-like disc-shaped thing called the apothecium, of which there's a little more than a dozen shown here. Most lichens are ascomycete fungi. Here's a cross-section of a foliose lichen showing all the things that were in that diagram. It shows the algal layer just below the upper cortex. It shows a white puffy region that occupies most of the cross-section, which is the medulla. Not very distinguishable because it's the same color as the lower cortex with rhizines extending from it, and we can see several apothecia. Here's the undersurface of that lichen, showing, well, its color is white. That's a nice distinguishing feature for this genus, which is Physia, and there are rhizines, attachment structures. Lichens, how they reproduce. Lichens sometimes, some species reproduce exclusively or partly sexually by the production of spores typically in apothecia, which, by the way, might seem odd because lichens are dual organisms and the fungus spores by themselves don't seem like they would be viable. But evidently they can meet up with free-living instances of the same algae that form the partnership and form a partnership. Many lichens also or exclusively reproduce asexually with some sort of asexual propagules. Soredia are powdery balls of fungus strands plus the algae that slough off from breaks in the upper surface. They're called soredia. Isidia have the same ingredients, if you will, except they're finger-like projections and they break off. And those are the two means of reproducing asexually. A lichen may produce isidia or soredia, but it won't produce both. Lichens may, however, produce apothecia and either soredia or isidia, or maybe just apothecia. Here's a cross-section showing through a microscope the asci, microscopic, each with 8 ascospores in it. Here are 2 lichens that show different ways of reproducing asexually. The finger-like projections that make the upper one look kind of rough is isidia, and the puffy little powdery aggregations that make the lower one look a little softer are soredia. And some lichens, especially the ones in the very important and widespread genus Punctilia, have breaks in the upper surface that are called pseudocyphalae, little holes in the cortex through which you can see the medulla. The colors of lichens are distinctive, and one color that you need to get an eye out for is this color that's caused by this chemical called usnic acid. It's present in a few lichens whose generic names begin with flavo, Flavopunctilia and Flavoparmelia, and a few others as well. It's a yellow-green color that's different from the grayish color or some other strikingly different color that lichens have. This is a Flavopunctilia, and you notice that yellowish-green color that's distinctive of usnic acid, and it is used to separate out a few different genera. And also, by the way, these lip-shaped clusters of Soralia, which are aggregations of Soredia. So, growth forms. The 3 major growth forms: crustose, foliose, and fruticose. Crusty, leafy, and shrubby. Crustose lichens, like this Porpidia on the right, can't be removed from the substrate. They often reproduce with apothecia. Here's another crustose lichen growing on bark. Most of the background here, that beigeish color, is lichen that's growing embedded in the bark tissues. It can't be separated from it. And look at all those apothecia. Here are 2 foliose lichens. Here's another foliose lichen showing some large aggregations of soredia called Soralia. This is a genus Physia. It's a light-colored lichen that's white underneath. Fruticose lichens. Fruticose lichens are sometimes tree-like, like this usnea. Sometimes they have this squameules in the base and these upright stalks called podetia. This is characteristic of many members of a very important genus called Cladonia. And some other members of the same genus, Cladonia, are tangled mats of branched podetia, and they don't have a primary squameules on the ground. They look like little pillows or tumbleweeds or something. And here's another example of a cladoniform lichen with squameules on the ground, but the podetia are cups. Other colors of lichens, here's a very brilliantly orange-yellow one, a golden-colored lichen. So we are learning 8 lichens. So, Flavoparmelia caparata. I forgot to type in common green shield lichen. Common green shield lichen is distinguished by the fact it's a fairly large foliose lichen that grows on bark. And it has that yellowish green, flavo color caused by usnic acid. It's serradiate is how it reproduces. And oh, by the way, one of the things about lichens is noteworthy is that they are presently one of the few happy stories with the environment. This lichen was nearly wiped out from Northeast and the Midwest in the mid-20th century when the air pollution got pretty bad. And then with the passage of the Clean Air Act and also, improvements in technology for having emissions reduced, it returned to areas where it was formerly wiped out. And now it's a very, very common lichen. So this is an index lichen for air pollution, and it's getting better. This is another lichen with that yellowish-green color. It has even broader lobes than the common green shield. This is a ruffle lichen. And ruffle lichen lobes stand up from the substrate, and they have, when they're young or in certain conditions, very long eyelash-like cilia extending from the margins. When they get older or in different conditions, they produce cerealia along the margins, and the cilia aren't present. So it's a little harder to identify, but there are a few other hints and tips. And this is common on fairly young branches in open woodlands where the air quality is good. Here's a lichen called mealy rosette lichen. It's in the genus Physia, which is a big genus of foliose lichens that are generally light gray and white underneath. And this lichen is very, very common on roadside trees, so much so that it might cover the bark of a tree, or so nearly cover the bark of a tree, you might just think the tree has grayer bark than it actually does. It has very fine lobes, a millimeter or less, and they break apart into coarse serratia, and it also reproduces sexually with apothecia, mealy rosette lichen. Here's another rosette lichen, that is to say, another member of the genus Physia. This is Physia stellaris. Gray above, white below. This one doesn't have any asexual reproductive structures. No isidia, no serratia, and it manages to reproduce entirely by the production of spores, which must find an algal partner out there in the environment and form a partnership. This is starry rosette lichen, Physia stellaris. Fairly common on young branches. It's sort of a pioneer lichen. It must be fairly fast growing, which many lichens aren't. Here's another very colorful one, and it's common on the bark of roadside trees, the same as mealy rosette lichen, and often occurring with it. It's more of a lemon yellow, mustard color rather than a gold color, and if you use those chemical spot tests, the one that's KOH, potassium hydroxide, no reaction. It'll just be like water on it. No difference in the color. Here's one though, similar color, a little more golden hue. It's called hooded sunburst lichen, and it's a member of a genus called Xantho Mendoza. And these guys, in addition to having that golden cast, which is not always super obvious, have a KOH reaction. It turns bright, brilliant, dark, bright, dark. Are those opposites? It turns a very intense purple when it's touched with potassium hydroxide. This particular one reproduces asexually by the means of serratia under split lobes of the thallus that extends up off the surface. Let's look at some fruticose lichens. So here's a fruticose lichen called bushy beard lichen. And this is another one that's kind of a happy story. Bushy beard lichen was fairly common across in open wood edges and in trees in unpolluted areas until most areas became polluted and it sort of became very scarce. And now it's returning, and there are records in Ohio counties where it hasn't been seen for 40 or 50 years. And it's reappearing happily. This particular specimen has apothecia. You can see one anyway, sort of toward the lower left in the middle. It looks like sort of a disc with the branches coming off behind it. This is bushy beard lichen, Usnea strigosa. And these are lichens that are very, very common in northern ecosystems on branches of trees. Here is a lichen that's one of those reindeer lichen types that has tubular podicia that are branched and branched again and kind of look like tangled balls of thread. This is a little more of a close-up than giving you a sense of what it looks like in the field. But that's helpful because it shows a feature that none of the other reindeer lichen type cladonias have. These guys grow out in the ground in nutrient-poor areas where they aren't shaded out by higher vegetation, and sometimes like dry hillsides, sometimes damp hillsides. And it's a fairly common species. Sometimes it forms these mats that are about, like a foot or two across. Maybe not quite that big, but pretty big. But what we see here is these little squamules, these little plates. You can see about a half a dozen of them that are extending off of the tubular podicia. Other reindeer lichen type cladonia species are completely smooth and don't have any squamules. To find the squamules of this many-forked Cladonia furcata, it helps to pick it up and look at the bottom. So those are the 8 lichens to know and love.